Welcome, mental, fully leaded education talk. Educators talking education. Dr. Johnny Lupinacci here, usually with my co-host, Dr. Tim Slecker. Tim, MIA. Maybe he's climbing Everest. Maybe he's over in Nepal. I don't know. Maybe he's behind the scenes of the Iron Curtain. He certainly does seem to like Marxism quite a bit. I like to tease him, but when he's here and when he's not here, he's actually not a Marxist. Both of us are more kind of anarchist social studies teachers, defenders of democracy, decentralized democracy. That's where, we the people are the government, popular sovereignty, those democratic core values that we love so much and learn to practice in our public schools. That loops us back around to why we have this show. It's fully leaded education talk. But I am here with chairman of the board, our producer, beloved Jakob. What did you say, that you were a veritable thesaurus?
I did
Monday?
say that, yeah. And
I love
listen,
this.
I'm not saying I know that much about dinosaurs, but I think I'm a thesaurus.
I think you are, man. You definitely love the words, man. I love your write-ups of the shows. You're knocking it out of the park with our podcast descriptions. And
They're getting
in general,
goofier as time goes on, Johnny. I don't. Someone's going to
No,
have
I
to
love
talk
it.
to me at some point.
No, man, I love it. Don't change a thing. It's fun. If you're not having fun and things aren't funny, then we're doing something wrong, right?
I
Because
agree.
there's a famous quote, we've mentioned quite a bit, and we'll touch on it today, that whoa, there are times in education and in life when it just seems like every day brings a new news headline that is just, you shake your head and you're like, really? This is what we're doing? And certainly for educators out there, that's been a reality for quite some time. It's like, wow, how, when we know so much about what's best for children, are we still not able to do those things? And on top of that, we're making legislative decisions to not do the things we know work best for kids. It's like, so what do you want? Do you want an educated nation of democratic citizens who are, participating strongly, not only in the economy as consumers, but as producers, as laborers, as, sharing ideas, making our communities better, safer, stronger, right? If you want those things, which I think kind of most of us do, I mean, that's nonpartisan. We want, sustainable, strong futures. Then, then, then support what kids need in schools. Right? Seems like a no-brainer, but yet here we go with more headlines. But Jakob, my point being that there's a famous quote from the playwright Bertolt Brecht where it said, "Will there be singing in dark times?" And the person responds, "Yes, they'll be singing about dark times." And I like to apply that rule in general to humor, to laughter, to joy. Will we find fun and funny in not so great times? Of course. We're going to poke fun. We're going to make jokes. We're going to find humor where we can to help us not only cope, but sift through. So humor and joy, that plays a role in sifting through the heaviness, the weight of some of these topics that are, to be quite blunt, pretty grim. We know what's best for children, yet we refuse to do what's best for children. We know how to support. We know we need to support teachers more, yet we don't do that, right? And so it's like the story over and over again. If we don't have humor, if we don't have more information about it, if we don't have conversations about it, Jakob, then what do we have? So I appreciate your descriptions, your participating in the show, and your superpower as a veritable thesaurus.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Johnny. I appreciate that. Yeah, I agree with you. It's good to have humor, especially even more so during difficult and dark times. That's the whole reason there's gallows humor, that you can be funny in the worst possible place you can think of, being in the gallows. So it helps people get through, and I think it's important. Not mine. I don't think what I do is important, but in general, I think it's important to have a good sense of humor.
No doubt, man. And we, speaking of humor, something I laughed to quite a bit as a kid and still even find enjoyable. You guys were talking about in homeroom. Right, just to clarify, clear the air. Jakob was right. I was just at a meeting. It's the end of my school year, folks. Even though I do some summer teaching, it is officially summer break, which isn't much of a break. We'll talk about that. Teachers, I call it the off season. It's just a change in our work. It's not the same work, but we're still working. That myth that the best part about teaching is, the months of June, July, and August because we're not in school. That's just a myth. That's part of the humor. We're actually in our off season. It's the time of year where we could go to the bank during normal banking hours. We can, schedule doctor's appointments during the day without having to find a sub cover for us. It's the time where we're retooling. We're setting goals for our learning. We're rethinking about what we're going to teach in our classrooms next year. What's something we might improve or change about what we did this year? And in some ways, we're letting our immune systems catch up because those germ factories of classrooms out there. We'll get back to that, Jacob, because I get to work with a lot of teachers. I'm a teacher educator, professor, also researching what's the condition of teaching in our schools. So talking to a lot of teachers about their experience the last couple of years, especially this last school year. And I always ask this a very standard question in all my conversations. I call them coffee talks. We meet. Some of them don't drink coffee. We drink something else, like maybe a sparkling water or, preferred a beverage of choice. A couple of pops, a couple of sodas with the teachers, But the idea being, I ask them like, hey, let's talk about your school year. What are some great things that happened? What are some stuff that were difficult moments, challenges that you faced as a teacher? But also, what are the things you're thinking about? What are your worries? What are the concerns you have? What are some of the things that you feel are on the forefront? If you could ask a master panel of other teachers, right? What you want to know more about, right? That's not just new teachers. I talk to veteran teachers because the good thing about teachers, Jacob, I think you get this already, is that they're always learning. Great teachers are always learning. That's why we're teaching people to be lifelong learners. I think this is true in any industry. The very best of the best are always learning. Even the greatest hockey player I'm probably watching on the ice in the last decade, Connor McDavid. I say it because it's playoff times. I mean, this guy's unbelievable to watch. He's always learning still, right? It's always adapting. The very best of the best teachers are always learning, right? And that doesn't mean they're back to school necessarily, but they're lifelong learners like they're teaching their kids to be. So, we asked that question of what would you like to learn more about? What are the biggest concerns or the kind of conversations? A caveat, Jacob, because I'm gonna dovetail into homeroom question that came up about using words like pedagogy and they're Tim simplified it as teaching, but I'm going to complicate it a little bit more. So there are certain industry terms. They're not used to make people think that teachers or professors are smarter than the rest of the world, but it is the science and study of teaching. That's what pedagogy means. It's the scientific practice of teaching. So all the theories that are connected to the teaching. It's sort of like if I said, well, don't call it biology, just call it science, right? I mean, like, yes, it's science, but
Yeah.
it is a particular kind of, set of practices with science. The other term I kind of throw with that pedagogy word, the study of, right? If we kind of do the etymology, pedagogy, the science of or the study of teaching, is the term praxis. I'm not talking about missing praxis like AI, praxis. We're talking about praxis, Praxis, praxis. That's when we are doing our best teaching or even our worst teaching, just teaching our practice, but we're doing it informed by theory, informed by conversations like we're having here on Busted Pencil. So let's say we had some great episodes this year with, suggestions and curriculum, suggestions for how to implement AI into your classroom. And when I'm, listening to Busted Pencils and thinking with Tim and Johnny and Jacob, or maybe it was Jess back then, or one of our wonderful guests, and you're like, man, that's a great idea. Let me look that up a bit. Let me read about it like good teachers often do. And then you implement it into your teaching. That's you're engaged in praxis, theory informed practice. And those are two terms that I want to de-intellectualize. And what I mean by that is I think intellectual work is really important, but they're everyday language words for teachers like praxis and pedagogy, right? Now it's teaching, but it's sort of the nuance, the digging into the study of our teaching. The way none of our teaching is just, hey, I'm going to walk in the room and see what happens with these kids. 30 little ones, one grown up. Let's see what happens. That's not what teachers are out there doing. They have a plan. Their plan is often informed by different theories, different approaches to learning that have informed them on how to structure their classroom and their teaching, right? And they have, a style. Like we have a game plan when we go. I mentioned earlier Connor McDavid. He's got a coach. He's got people teaching him all the time, even though he's one of the greatest hockey players. He's on the ice. He's executing a plan. He's engaged in hockey praxis, right? Not practice. Practice helps us be stronger at our praxis, but I'm talking about praxis with an X, Praxis, right? Bringing it like Terminator X from one of my favorite bands. We'll get back to that. That's a little question. See if Jakob nails who was Terminator X the DJ for. I know listeners out there that maybe around my age know exactly who that is. We'll come back to it. We'll drop more hints, but that's my trivia for Jakob. If you can nail that by the end of the show, you aren't just the word thesaurus. You are a man.
Yeah, I'm going to need some of those hints coming up because look, Johnny, I'm not just chairman of the boards. I'm also half your age. So you're going to have to meet me where I am.
Okay. Terminator X was the DJ or a band front man. Well, I could say two people, although I like to give sort of the theoretical credit to one. Chuck D.
Public Enemy?
You, my man.
Public Enemy.
Public Enemy number one.
Yeah.
So phenomenal band, still doing the work. Public Enemy, Chuck D, one of, I would say, as a kid of the 90s, 80s and 90s, but really coming of age in the 90s, becoming a teacher in the end of that great century, right? Public Enemy, one of my teachers. Chuck D, for sure, teacher, artist, man. He just drops knowledge. We'll get back to that. I digress a bit, though, Jakob. To come back to that whole context of praxis, informed teaching. And how do we know about like theory that informs our teaching, that praxis I'm calling? How do we know about it? We know about it because we have the study of teaching and learning, pedagogy, the study of teaching. So people whose job it is to study all these different things, right, that are happening in classrooms, how children learn, how, whether we do better in groups or whether we do better, individually, or maybe it's a mix because kids have different learning styles. How should we teach kids with different learning styles? That all falls under the umbrella. Who figures that out, Jakob? The people who are engaged in studying pedagogy, the study of teaching and learning. So I know Tim dropped that. Hey, it's just teaching. Don't use that word. I'm going to be like, Tim, come on, man. Are we in another beef? But also, Jakob, Tim and I always beef because I don't always get the sarcasm. That's one of my kryptonites. Sometimes Tim is being sarcastic and I think he's being serious. And then I'm like, them's are fighting words, Tim. And he's like, that's the sarcasm. And I'm like, oh, listeners, no, that went right over Johnny's head. And he's all amped up about things. But Tim and Jakob, you guys talked about one of my favorite shows of all time, Sesame Street. Right?
We did.
Yeah. And I think Tim, he's like, he was saying, the accusations, and he's not wrong. The accusations of, and I hate to get into this because I'm always trying to find more complex, nuanced ways than saying, well, the conservative media or the liberal media, like the polarized, and you nailed it, Jakob. We're in that so-called culture war, which is real. I hate to get pulled into its vortex because at the end of the day, it's so far from what all of us on the ground in our neighborhoods and communities are actually experiencing from one another, right? It's so far from those. It's so polarizing that it seems futile at this point, but it's real. And yes, there are, people on the far right saying Sesame Street is a communist, like it's trying to instill communist values or whatever. And you guys talked about Bert and Ernie and Rubber Ducky and all the things, but they're not wrong. I'm not going to say communist because I think that's ridiculous because it's obviously it came to its rise during the Cold War. It gained its largest popularity in the thick of the Cold War, which I got to be a kid during, and most listeners did too, right? Unless you're younger and you're listening and you're like, Cold War, what's that? Right? That's before global warming. Now, global warming was already starting up, but something different. It was sort of like a political battle between, you know, capitalist democracies and communist experiments, mostly USA versus Russia, the USSR back then, now Russia, and communism versus democracy kind of stuff. Um, and I won't get into too much of the social studies details of that, but when we talk about Sesame Street, I want to give it credit because it was born. It's a little mini history lesson, right? It was born in the late 60s, right? Premiered, right, in 1969. I'll call that a nodal year. Like, holy smokes, stuff that was happening in this country in 1969 was paradigm shifting. I know some of our listeners are old enough to remember that, and you're like, yeah, the late 60s, especially 1969. Paradigm shifting, in fact, destabilizing in some contexts. There were assassinations, there were political fear, there was a height of a Cold War happening. There were a lot of discussions going on. But when we think about Sesame Street, we think about something that created in the late 60s was related to and born out of President Johnson's war on poverty, which wasn't only Johnson's, but it was a continued effort as a nation to say, hey, we want to end poverty. And Jacob, things haven't changed much since then in terms of one of the things we know is early childhood interventions are wise investments against two things: poverty and imprisonment. Okay? So this is by and large, and I know some folks a little older than me can probably say, come on, it wasn't so romantic, Johnny. There was disagreement with that back then. I know that. But a large effort from people in that era to say, let's end poverty. Let's end childhood hunger. Let's end children in poverty. And what could be an equalizer in that? Schools, public education. But what about for kids who are too little to be in schools? Well, we need preschool programs. Well, that's a little easier said than done. What can we do to help educate children who aren't in preschool yet, or who aren't able to get to a good quality preschool or can't afford those options? We don't necessarily have those widespread Head Start programs, which also, Jacob, are being cut in the moment as well, which is another real blatant attack on childhood. But you know what I'm saying here is like the war to end poverty is to say invest in children learning, because two things go down when you have early childhood investment in their education and their learning: poverty, right? Joblessness, homelessness, these epidemics right now in our country, and imprisonment, which we also know those things conflict with a political agenda to increase the number of people in prison because it's been privatized and it's an investment, as well as to increase the number of people in poverty, right? Which let's be just blunt about this. The current administration's actions, I'm going to say their actions. I don't know their intentions. I'm not going to accuse them of their intentions because they know their intentions. In fact, they spelled them out for us in documents, but I'll just stick to the actions. All the actions they are taking show to me that they want more poor people. Not only do they want more people living in poverty, but they specifically want more people not only in poverty and locked into systems of debt, but also they want to increase the number of people in prison, which doesn't make economic sense because people in prison cost more money. Let's not even get into the politics of Johnny basically being an abolitionist. It's a little more complicated than that. I mean, I've for a number of years spent some time thinking like we should not have prisons, and I've maybe shifted a bit on that. But I absolutely do not think that we should have a prison industry, a privatized for-profit prison system. Right? It seems antithetical to the goals of democracy and to rehabilitation and to acknowledging that there are consequences for actions, but it's turned to profitize it a bit to make it private has really, I think, done an ethical turn away from democracy in that context. So, I mean, I'll get into that any other time. We can have a whole show on like the school to prison pipeline or the school to prison nexus. But the idea here being it costs. I'm not an instrumentalist, but I'll share the instrumentalist argument. The cost to keep somebody in prison is way more. You can dig up the numbers. A few years back, it was close to 30 grand. Do the math. Schools know to educate a child in a public education system around, 12 to $18,000 is adequate. We might even say a little bit more with inflation right now. 18 to 20. Let's even be generous. It's less expensive to educate a child for a few years than it is to keep somebody who's incarcerated in prison. And we know we have statistical significance around this, that early education intervention, your success in school, right, inoculates you from most likely being incarcerated. Now that, Jacob, I'll take out of the equation like extreme sociopaths and like serial killers and
Sure.
stuff like that. That, the outlier case where someone say, well, this prisoner has, college education and that. No, I do believe that there are some, dispositions and traumas inflicted. I'm not a psychologist, educator, and educational researcher, so I'm tangent to that stuff. But that doesn't say that it's eliminating all crime. Just saying it's been shown to have statistically significantly reduced the number of people who turn to crime, right, or who end up incarcerated. Which, Jacob, if we've privatized prisons, cuts into profits. So these two things, it's hard to ignore. Why are we cutting Sesame Street? Well, because it educates children, and we've already made classrooms a battlefield. Let's make the living room of everybody's home also a battlefield. Let's take away the things that for ages people were able to access as a supplement to their education. Right. And I'll get a little bit more into that, too, because I want to give Sesame Street some more props. I loved hearing Tim sing Rubber Ducky, one of my favorite. I was just talking with someone the other day. One of my other favorites was Grover's Near and Far. Loved that. And then
what did that sound like, Johnny?
Near, far, near. I loved that stuff. Him running up near and then running back far. The other thing being there was a waiter. There's a fly in my soup. Oh my God, that's a classic line, still often dropped at restaurants. If you have a friend or you yourself are a server, I spent some time doing restaurant work. A good reference to Sesame Street when someone says, "Well, waiter, there's a fly in my soup," right? But nonetheless, Sesame Street for decades, unapologetically, was designed to have educational benefits. In fact, studies showed that children who watched Sesame Street were 16% less likely to fall behind in school, right? They also know that Sesame Street, remember, it premiered in 1969. And so this is why I want to give credit to the far right. They do have opposition to this because Sesame Street is not trying to promote communism, but they absolutely were trying to be in living rooms in a way to help mediate the importance of cultural representation of global communities, right? Sesame Street intentionally committed to representation of diversity for minority children and families and exposed all of us coming up to a multicultural environment, even if we didn't necessarily live in a multicultural environment. I mean, this is a gift to say, okay, the world is diverse. It's growingly multilingual. But what if I live in a predominantly monolingual and everyone kind of looks somewhat similar? I could say maybe a predominantly white community. Nothing wrong with that. Although we can get into sort of not me advocating here for all white communities or white supremacy in any context, but say I grow up in not in a city, which historically meant like rural, predominantly white or segregated communities. Well, Sesame Street was integrating some of those ideas of like humanizing our diverse cultures, dispelling myths, piquing curiosity in a respectful, non-appropriative way for decades and decades. They also, like Mr. Rogers, I'll throw him in there with PBS. addressed difficult topics. Sesame Street, right? They talk about death, divorce, racism, disability, all kinds of things, you know, wants and needs. All I mean, as a social studies teacher, Sesame Street is like an early childhood dream for my students to have a connection to. They've already had some foundational groundwork laid, not just around their ABCs, but around democracy, around neighborhoods, around community. That's the whole idea, Sesame Street, right? Where people kind of were different, but got along, navigated their differences, their emotions. So, like social emotional learning, right, was happening in Sesame Streets, not only for kids, but, for adults who are listening along and they're part of that conversation. It's what I would call, a kind of pedagogy, back to that science of teaching, right? It's informed by the idea that to learn means we should be comfortable, welcomed to the learning, right? What more comfortable space than our living room together listening with the fun of songs and puppets and everything, but navigating things that we're pushing, like Piaget said, right? Or Vygotsky, the zone of proximal development, when we're in that little bit of uncomfortable space, like a new idea, change, helping facilitate that change in a really welcoming way. Sesame Street providing that sort of critical pedagogy, that shifting and changing how we see the world through inviting us into a conversation, like Tim does when Tim says, "Hey, Busted Pencils, we're for you, all of you." It's about having a conversation with our neighbors, right? That's what it's about, is being, I'll use a big word because I'm not anti-intellectual. I think blue collar scholars, like Jacob, you said, we are word thesauruses. We love words because words are what we have, right? When we talk, right? Certain words ought not to be only able to be used by people who have mastered only the Queen's English. So I'll use some big words here. Good teaching should be ontologically welcoming and epistemologically challenging. And what that means, Jacob, is that ontologically, we should be welcomed where we're at, acknowledged for who we are, the cultures we come from, all of you, all you listeners. Like, you should be able to learn where you're at, what you're comfortable with. And sometimes that learning should shift how you think a bit. It should get you to think, what are the foundations of your thinking? And so, Jacob, it should not be surprising to us that this current administration wants to end not only Sesame Street, but this kind of effort through public broadcasting. And you mentioned it, Jacob. You said it seems to be consistent from conservatives around the world because, the end goal here is to limit the possibilities of people engaged in that ontologically comforting, epistemologically challenging work, right? We don't want communities. Now I say we, not me or you, Jacob, or most of our listeners, but the people advocating against something like Sesame Street. It's not that they're fearing communism. We're not going to have a communist country here in the United States, and it's just never going to happen. Democracy is the antithesis of communism. And we're going to have strong local involvement here in the US. It's just kind of why we overthrew a king to have a revolution in a country, right? We're not going to go to a dictatorship anytime. I don't fear that. But we are losing democracy in a lot of ways. And to me, Sesame Street embodies the kind of learning that values democracy. So is Mr. Rogers. So does a lot of the other shows. It sort of was the litmus test, much like civic media radio, right? Saying, hey, we are committed to democracy. We are also committed to local radio refreshed. It's like saying, hey, how can we have content that's ontologically comforting? It says, hey, welcome to the show. This is Busted Pencils. Got some blue collar scholars here, which Tim and I most certainly are. And Jacob, you fit into the mix quite well. Appreciate having you here. You're a good fit for our listeners and for us. But you should feel comfortable and welcome here. But also know that at times we're going to push you to think. Tim and Johnny sometimes are going to disagree. We're going to beef a little. Jacob's going to say, whoa, guys, hold on. The three of us might disagree, and that's okay because that's part of being in a democracy. Absolutely love being able to kind of go off on a tangent today for class and session. You know, it was a blitzkrieg of commentary from me, Jacob. So thanks for having me. You know, man the station today. We'll be back, you know, with Tim in saddle, Tim and Johnny and Jacob back in the saddle soon. So listeners, thanks for listening. And now it's time for your moment of zen. Objectivity is not desirable because if we want to have an effect on the world, we need to emphasize those things which will make students more active citizens and more moral people. Hey, thanks for listening to today's Busted Pencils class and shot session. A lot of hot air from Johnny. We'll get back with Tim, Johnny, and Jacob soon. You can always grab great podcasts like this one. Just search Busted Pencils on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Of course, you can always find us on the Civic Media website or get at us at bustedpencils.com. Hey, and don't forget, you can find us throughout the week, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday with homerooms, classes in session, and always loads of fun to wrap up the week with hurdles and home runs. And listen up, pencil busters. I know some of you know it, but if you don't, now you will. You can always catch Busted Pencils at 3 p.m. Central Time across all the Civic Media Network stations for an hour of your favorite blue-collar scholars, Tim and Johnny, and keep busted pencils.